Top U.S. and Russian officials are set to meet in Saudi Arabia to discuss a summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin says the talks will also focus on, quote, a possible truce in Ukraine and the restoration of bilateral ties. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has arrived in Riyadh, leading a delegation which includes National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and White House Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff. The talks mark the first high-level in-person discussions between Washington and Moscow in years. Ukraine reportedly not expected to be involved in these discussions. The meeting follows U.S. President Donald Trump's phone call with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin just last week, during which the pair discussed starting negotiations on the nearly 3-year war in Ukraine. Mr. Trump's push for a peace deal has sparked tension as European allies and Ukraine were not consulted beforehand, leaving some nations in the region feeling sidelined. In response, European leaders are holding an emergency summit in Paris today, hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron. And for more, Simon Marks joins us live from Washington, D.C., and Ross Cullen from Paris. As I speak to Ross first. Ross, we just mentioned an emergency summit in Paris. European leaders, a real sense of emergency there. What are we likely to be coming out from these emergency talks?
Well, certainly a hastily arranged summit coming off the back of the Munich Security Conference and the speech, particularly from the United States Vice President J.D. Vance, that shocked Europe. Now, the French are trying to play down the idea that this is an emergency summit, saying it's just regular talks between government leaders. But there's absolutely no doubt that there is a sense of urgency between European governments for two main key areas. Firstly, how to continue to support Ukraine, to increase defence spending to Ukraine, increase diplomatic and humanitarian assistance, and now growing ever stronger the calls for European boots on the ground. On the eve of the summit, Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, who is going to be in attendance at the talks, which get underway here in the French capital in just a couple of hours' time, he said, quote, the UK is ready and willing to contribute security guarantees to Ukraine by putting our own troops on the ground if necessary. Now, this is an idea that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, first floated in February last year, saying that we will not rule out putting boots on the ground inside Ukraine. We've also heard from Sweden today, which has said we are not ruling out Swedish troops being deployed to Ukraine in a peacekeeping context. So if there were to be an end to the war, if there were to be a ceasefire and an agreement that European peacekeeping troops would be required, we know that UK and France are at the vanguard of that idea. Certainly that will be one of the key themes discussed today at that summit, and also how to increase our collective security, because there is this realization now in Europe, growing ever wider, the idea that the US is going to be stepping back in some way, is going to be reforming its role as a backstop for European security. And so European capitals and heads of government are going to have to work out how to increase their spending, increase the size of their armed forces, and increase their own domestic military industrial complexes.
Well, thanks, Russ. Let's speak to Simon Marks in Washington, D.C. Well, if the U.S. is being seen as stepping back, reforming its position, it's certainly not stepping back when it comes to reaching out to Russia. The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Riyadh, leading a delegation, is meeting Russia's foreign minister as part of that delegation. What can we expect from these talks between the U.S. and Russian side?
Well, the Trump administration says that these talks are preparatory and are designed to set the stage for full-scale peace negotiations. But it is still very unclear what role the White House envisages the aggrieved party, Ukraine, playing in all of this. Remember that the Ukrainians say that they have not been invited to participate in this meeting in Riyadh. The Americans say they are included in the conversation, but that is by dint of the fact that President Trump had a conversation with Volodymyr Zelensky last week after talking with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And even some Republicans up on Capitol Hill, members of Donald Trump's own party, are looking for the outcome of these talks in Riyadh to give them some evidence that President Trump and President Putin see this peace process as something more than just a carve-up between the United States and Russia of Ukraine. So there are fears among even some of Donald Trump's Republican lawmakers in Washington, D.C., that the White House now needs to do more to demonstrate that there is going to be inclusivity in this process. The Americans say the Europeans certainly won't be around the table for conversations, which is another huge issue. And of course, the biggest question of all hanging over the meeting in Saudi Arabia is what might we see the face-to-face meeting in Saudi Arabia between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump that President Trump forecast just a few days ago.
Thanks. Simon Marks there in Washington, D.C. and Ross Cullen in Paris. We're looking at parallel meetings on the same issue.